This is the 6th video looking at evaluation of expansionary fiscal policy, and in the last videos I've explained what that is, and that's just up here in case you want to look. And the one that we're looking at now is what are the future, so not right now but in the future, negative and positive implications of expansionary fiscal policy. So remembering that expansionary fiscal policy is increase in government spending and or a decrease in taxation. So let's look at the positive things first. And if you have this expansionary fiscal policy, there are going to be questions about how the money is spent. So depending on what your government spending is spent on, it's going to potentially increase the standard of living in the long term in the country. Because, for example, if they're spending more money on the NHS, they're spending more money on education, those things will improve the quality of life for people living in the country. Also, they might be spending more money, for instance, on policing. People might feel more safe. So there are potential benefits. There are lots of different things that the government might spend the money on, which would increase the standard of living. The other thing as well is if the government spending is going to increase the economy's productive potential, that on this diagram would increase the long-run aggregate supply. And if you, that should say supply. If you increase the long-run aggregate supply and you have greater productive potential, that will reduce inflationary pressures that you have in the economy, because if you imagine if this curve is over here, the price level would come down to here. And also, if you have greater productive potential, that means that you're able to increase your output and you're able to produce more goods and services, which requires more people. So that could also increase the amount of jobs that are available. Also, if you're increasing your productive potential and you have positive economic growth, you have all of the benefits associated with that in the longer term, which again can improve the standard of living in the country. It could improve tax receipts. It could allow more government spending in future. So there are lots of positive things that can go on that are going to affect people living in the country. And also, aside from the government spending going up, if taxes go down over the long term, it might mean that you find that people living in the country have a higher standard of living because they have more disposable income, for example, if their income tax goes down. And also for businesses, they're able to invest more, and you could argue that they can expand more, create more jobs. These are all positive things for the long term. However, there are going to be negatives as well, and these negatives relate to, firstly, not really in the future, but right now, what do they spend the money on? But in the future, depending on what they've spent the money on, will it actually have helped the economy? So government spending, where is this spent? Does it actually impact people's lives for the positive, or is the money misspent? Are they spending a lot of money, for example, on defence, which actually people in the country might consider that's unnecessary? So extra spending, for example, on aircraft carriers, which people don't think is improving their quality of life even in the long term. That's a very subjective thing about where people think money should be spent. Another thing is, are all people in the long term going to be affected or positively affected equally? So it might be that the government choose to spend the money on things that in the long term benefit some groups much more than other groups. So for example, if you see an increase in the spending on the NHS, if you have ill health, you'd be particularly supportive of that. But if you don't have ill health and enormous amounts of the money are being spent on the NHS, you may feel that the expansionary fiscal policy hasn't benefited you as much as it has other people. Another thing, which is really fundamental here about expansionary fiscal policy, is that it's likely to lead to a budget deficit. And remember, a budget deficit means that your government spending is greater than the tax revenue that the government are collecting in. And if you have a budget deficit, this means that the government are going to have to borrow money. And every time you have a budget deficit, if you keep on having them, you're going to increase your national debt as an economy. And remember, national debt is cumulative. That's measured over time. And if you keep on having a budget deficit, as a country, you're having to borrow more and more money from abroad, usually from issuing bonds. And what this means for the future is you need to look at future generations. If our economy is having to borrow a lot of money, if the government's having to borrow a lot of money because they're spending more than they're receiving in tax revenue because of expansionary fiscal policy, then for future generations, at some point, we're going to have to repay this national debt. And this is one of the big arguments against having a large national debt and even having budget deficits each year, is that future generations are going to have to pay for this, because the money that has been borrowed has to be repaid, and essentially also the interest has to be repaid on that as well. And how are they going to get the money to repay the national debt? The argument would go that future generations will see higher taxes and that their quality of life will go down. And if you think that's the case, then you might think that this expansionary fiscal policy actually isn't as beneficial as you thought it was initially. So you need to think not only about what happens today, but if you're evaluating, think about the future implications for people living in the country of having this expansionary fiscal policy.